how to fix WordPress server error 5xx for Google Search Console index coverage report. In this video session, I'm going to show you step-by-step techniques for ensuring that your WordPress built site does not encounter server error 5xx. You're more than welcome to visit RankYa blog to learn more about this server error 5xx, what it means and so on. Because Google Search Console doesn't really tell us exactly what the error was on the web server. So therefore it just says, you know what, as far as we're concerned, it's server error 5xx. The help section, if you were to read through it, that's rather confusing for most WordPress website owners. Okay, so in this video session, I'll try my best to explain while I show you how to fix it. But I'm not going to go in depth and stop at each scenario and explain how Google works and how WordPress site works. Okay, so what we can do when we end up analyzing the coverage report, server error 5xx, we can look at the affected URLs. Keep an eye on the date ranges here, meaning I'll show you my valued client Search Console reports. It'll be blurred on certain elements here, right, for privacy reasons. So when we look at this is a different Search Console web property. And here, as you can see, the date ranges are different. Now, what does this say? What this says to you is, if the server error 5xx happened perhaps 2 weeks ago and you don't see it anymore, as in Google doesn't see it anymore, then perhaps you can ignore it because there's nothing wrong. It could be a moment in time whereby there was a problem with the web server. It could be a maintenance, it could be a reboot. Okay, but if the error happens consistently for the URLs that you want to rank in Google, then you need to fix it because it's an error. Index coverage report basically says the URLs that you want Google to index and show to searchers, we're having problems trying to understand what the URL is all about. So what we can do is press on the example here and then inspect the URL samples. And here the referring pages are important. What this shows you is these are sample URLs that Google has actually seen the affected URL. Okay, so if I go and visit this URL, now I can say, okay, you know what, while I'm troubleshooting this problem, where's this URL that Google is seeing? Now, looking at the front of a web page doesn't really say much, right? So what we can do is press on Ctrl-U on our keyboard. Now I can say, okay, you know what? Is the URL within the content somewhere? As in within the source code, because that's what Google sees. Okay, Google doesn't see this. Google looks at this and analyzes what's here. So now I can search this and say, okay, there is a tagged as this URL, right? So that's what you need to do. You need to analyze what's going on because server error 5xx doesn't really say much in Search Console. So this is how you troubleshoot, because there could be many different URLs that your WordPress built site is having problems with Google. So the best way to fix it is this. Simply visit RankYa blog, look for how to fix WordPress server error 5xx, because within it I've explained what could be the problem, because it's typical WordPress setup, so to speak. I'll show you a sample to demonstrate what I mean. Let's imagine your WordPress theme has an internal includes PHP file. Let me go and request this to see what happens. As you can see, HTTP error 500. So that's an internal server error. That means if somehow Google has seen this URL somewhere on my website, it will try to request it to understand what that page is, what that URL is. But since that's an internal file that is needed for my WordPress theme to work, the server will throw an error, as in WordPress won't show this to Google or to people. Okay? So now what you can do is log into your web hosting account and locate File Manager and browse into the folder where your WordPress site is installed. Then, looking at the URL that is having problems, looking at the Search Console coverage report, pressing on server error, you can analyze this to see what URLs, because in my example it's tags, right? Typical WordPress setup. Tag URLs, there's nothing unique there. Now I'll show you my valued client sample URL to demonstrate that plugins folder could also be having problems, or a themes folder. As you can see in my valued clients example, it's a plugin that Google is seeing the URL in some WordPress plugin that it shouldn't see. So this is how you fix it. Once you identify the folder location, whether it's WordPress content plugins folder, whether WordPress includes folder, whether WordPress admins folder, then you browse into it. Then press on new file into the folder. Remember, we're creating a brand new file within WP-includes to avoid server error, the internal server errors coming from WP-includes folder, because that happens. But if yours isn't in WP-includes folder, let's imagine it's in plugins folder. Then you go to WP-content and browse into the plugins folder, and within here you can actually create a new file. Okay, let me actually create it within plugins folder. Okay, let's create a new file. It's very important that we begin with dot. Okay, make sure you press dot, it's next to the question mark on your keyboard, and then name that file hdaccess. So let's create that file, and now we've got a brand new file within plugins folder. Now we can right click, edit. Now what goes into that file? Simply copy this, copy that, and place it in to that .hdaccess file in plugins folder if Search Console coverage report was complaining about URLs in the plugins folder. Okay, so you can actually place this file in plugins folder if you want and save changes, or you can actually place it into, let's say, this folder. Let's imagine the problem was within RankYa schema post widget plugin. If that's the case, you could create .hdaccess file in that folder. It is absolutely important that you do not place that code within the root folder of your server, or else Google will de-index your entire website till you remove those directives. Okay, so let's go back, because I want to delete that so that I don't forget. Let me delete it, skip the trash, that's gone. Okay, so that's one way to fix server error 5xx. Now what's next? What else can you do? The next part is that within the root folder of your WordPress installation, look for a file called robots.txt. If you do see one in there, then right click, download first to make a backup, then right click, edit. If there is no file called robots.txt, then create a new file and call it robots.txt. Okay, and simply create the file. Now, what goes into that file? You can place what you see in this image here. So simply visit RankYa blog, and you need to write this manually. Okay, all you need is user-agent : Googlebot, then disallow. Let's imagine this admin. Let's imagine disallow includes. Let's imagine disallow WP-content plugins with the asterisk symbol. Okay, so simply visit RankYa blog to learn more about this, because you can place these directives within robots.txt file. Then what will happen is, once you place that .htxs file into the location Google is having problems with, then when you add the directives within robots.txt file, which is the first file Google requests anytime it visits your WordPress site, robots.txt file. This is an important file. You can further optimize it. What I'm showing you is a very complex one. All you need to do is simply have 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of code, and that will avoid most of the server error that Search Console is having with your website. Okay, then if you want, this is optional only, and it's actually smart to do so, you can specifically allow certain files by using allow directive, and that looks like this. Basically, you're saying, you know what, in this example, I'm allowing Googlebot to access this uploads folder where WordPress images are located. Okay, so you can once again visit RankYa blog, request robots.txt file to see what else you can do. I'll highlight these 4 lines here. This is actually a smart WordPress optimization by disallowing the search results, reply to the comments, URLs, and so on, because then you won't waste time looking at unimportant server errors. Because in this example for RankYa blog, I can actually visit the URL to say, okay, you know what, can I see it? Because what Google sees could be different. So that's the tricky part. You can actually press on F12 on your keyboard using Web Developer Toolbar using Google Chrome. You can actually look at the network and request the page to see, what's going on here? Is the status all 200? As you can see, that's 204, that's 200. 200 is okay. But if it's, let's say, 500, then you can further analyze the problem looking at the network tab in Web Developer Toolbar. Okay, so what's next? What is the best practice? Here's the problem with most WordPress site owners, especially when they end up listening to so-called SEO gurus or experts who don't understand how things work. What you need to do to make sure that you don't see server error 5xx for a WordPress site is you need to ask yourself, what part of my WordPress site has original content? That's the first question when you want to optimize a WordPress site. Because then, looking at your website structure, if your blog posts, as in if you're blogging, your blog posts are important. If you're a small business owner, your service page, let's say your pages, they are important because it highlights your business, for example. If you operate an e-commerce site, then your product URLs are important. But the way WordPress works is that it creates categories, it creates date, archives, it creates pagination, and all that stuff. So when you then understand how WordPress works, first question always is, what is the original content that I want people to search Google and find me for? Once you answer that question, the rest of WordPress, whether it's categories, whether it's tags, whether it's date archives, paginated content, Google doesn't need to see that at all. So then what you need to do is use XML Sitemaps. If you're using the popular Yoast SEO plugin, then it has XML Sitemap functionality. But the way the Yoast works is that by default it just creates the sitemaps, as we can see. In my example, I have made sure that search appearance, removes, let's say, tags. I don't want that in Google, so you can tweak that setting here. I'm not going to cover that because RankYa YouTube channel shows you how to set up Yoast correctly. But what's very, very important when you want to avoid most of the problems in Google Search Console is that your sitemap, XML sitemap, is absolutely important to get it right. Because when you use XML sitemap in Search Console, what you're telling Google is, you know what, Google? Here's the map of my website. That means if you have submitted the parent sitemap for, let's say, Yoast creates the parent sitemap, right? So where is it? Most people end up submitting this as their sitemap, which is a critical mistake. You'd never want to do that. Or else you'll end up seeing index coverage, server errors, redirection errors, 404 errors, too many errors that's gonna waste your time. Because do you really want to rank for your tag URLs? No, you want to rank for the actual URL. That's very important for Google rankings, okay? So in my scenario, it's posts, because I blog post. I have pages that I want Google to see and show its searchers. If you operate a WooCommerce, then your product URLs are the only sitemaps that you should be submitting to Search Console, nothing more. Also, with robots.txt file, since it's the first file that Google requests before it looks at anything on your website, what you can do is make sure that you can use sitemap directives here in robots.txt file. That's a better option to better guide Google in terms of the structure of your website, because Google is a hungry search engine. That means it's just going to request whatever the URL that it finds, and then you'll end up seeing server error 5xx for URLs that shouldn't be in Google index. In my example, there is one more insight that I can share with you, and this is actually smart to optimize WordPress sites accordingly, is that your theme folder has header.php file. Within that, you can use many directives, and it's actually smart that you do. I'm not going to cover it because I've included more insights on RankYa blog about what to do here. So in my example, for me to remedy server error for these tag URLs, what I can do is say, you know what? Okay, what was the URL, which is this, so I can visit it and say, let me look at the source code. Let me look at any robots directives. Here, as you can see, it says robots no index. Okay, so this will not be in Google's index. So I can actually do something like this. Look at the cached version, and I can see it's not in Google's cache. So now I can say, you know what? Server error 5xx for this particular example. Here, let me validate the fix, because I know I'm serving no index. I'm telling Google, you know what? Do not put this URL in your index. Okay. Now this will be complex. That's why I have not shown you the sample code, but rather tell you what you can do to avoid many different errors in Search Console and also have a better optimized WordPress site. In fact, without using directives like this, in header.php file, no WordPress site can be labeled optimized. At least you now know better methods for fixing server errors, as well as best practices for avoiding many errors in Search Console, so that Google looks at your WordPress site differently. And it all starts with understanding what sitemaps you should be submitting to Google, then using the techniques that I've shown you, and making sure that robots.txt file is better optimized. This is how you fix server error 5xx for WordPress site. Which method you should use? You should use all of them. I thank you very much for learning with RankYa, and I'll talk with you in the next video session.